Welcome to the March 18th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today's working title is An Economic Strategy to Push Back Against Trump. My guest is Dr. Chris Bataille, an energy economist I've interviewed many times over the years and appreciate his insights. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Lovely to be here, Markham.
Now, viewers, what we're going to talk about today is an economic strategy that is sort of evolving out of comments that Dr. Torsten Jackert, who is an economist at the University of British Columbia, said about 2, 3 weeks ago on this show. And we were talking about this issue, and he said Canada's best response to U.S. tariffs is to add value to its natural resources. And that really is the basis of much of the Canadian economy is oil and gas, timber, minerals, agricultural produce, fisheries. That is the bulk of it. And it has been for decades, probably centuries, really, you could say. So the question that Chris and I are going to be discussing today is, can you electrify the extraction of those resources and then the whatever processes are used to turn them into value-added products, can those be electrified? So, Chris, I've watched your work on things like the electrification of steelmaking in Europe for a long time now, so I know that you're up on this. Give us your general response to the evolution of electric technologies and processes and whether they're competitive.
That's an excellent question, Markham. The simple fact is you can electrify anything, right? The basic technology, technology exists to do that. The question is, do you go through the research and development and commercialization to get the technology up to full scale? And more importantly, and probably this is the reason we've been stuck on coal and natural gas, is the amount of instantaneous capacity of electricity you need to get a job done. Now, very interesting, back in the 70s and 80s, when the people thought we were running out of crude oil and gas, an enormous amount of research was done on the electrification on a lot of technologies because they thought a lot of nuclear power would be available. That didn't happen. Crude oil and gas fell in price, and we kind of went back to that path. But the simple fact is we can electrify just about everything.
Okay, so let's talk about electrifying the extraction of some of these resources. Now, oil and gas is a big one because I kind of come at this from the emissions side of things,
Mhm.
where the oil sands in particular is the biggest oil and gas emitter in Canada. And the reason it does is because it's either burning pet coke in boilers to create steam, or it's burning natural gas, and then and that combustion gives off emissions. So the question, and I know there's a technology in Calgary. The company is called Accelaware, and essentially it's an electric. Think of it, RFX. It's like a microwave.
Mhm.
I've interviewed the CEO a couple of times, and you for the SAGD, steam assisted gravity drainage, in situ bitumen processing, you stick it down into the reservoir, and instead of injecting steam to liquefy the bitumen, you use these microwaves for comparison, but nevertheless, gets you the idea. Is that kind of technology on the shelf, ready to go, close to commercialization?
Okay, so the oil sands is an interesting case onto itself, right? Like the oil sands largely developed on the premise of very cheap natural gas. And natural gas delivers a lot of heat really quickly at 2200, typically 1800 to 2200 C. Now, most of the conventional oil industry, on the other hand, sort of light, medium, conventional, it's a lot of drilling, it's a lot of pumping, it's a lot of low grade heat needed to get it to the batteries, get it sorted into its components, send it to a refinery. Now, conventional oil, oddly, is more easily electrifiable than the oil sands at this
Oh,
point in time, simply because it's a lot of low grade heat, and electricity is great for that, especially using heat pumps, heat batteries. If you had a lot, say Alberta allowed a lot of wind and solar to be built, there are times of the day where there'd be surplus. You could use those to fill the batteries, what have you. You then run out the batteries at night and use those for when I say batteries now, it's the crude oil batteries for heat to keep the oil moving down the lines and what have you. So conventional oil is mostly electrifiable with mostly existing or near commercial technologies. Oil sands is a little You want to stop me? Go ahead.
I do. I want to make the point that some of the conventional oil production is already electrified. So,
Yeah,
if you've got a pump jack sitting on a
right.
conventional well, and by the way, there are 155,000 conventional oil wells producing in, or oil and gas wells producing in Alberta. So that's how many we're talking about. But if the pump jack is electrified, the drilling rig is not. That's often you see the odd one, but they're mostly driven by the diesel engine of the rig that's on the rig. And other parts of the battery can maybe are electrified, maybe not. So really, it's to complete the electrification. Is that a fair thing to say?
It's to complete it and to change your attitude how you deal with transmission. It's being willing to bring transmission in as needed to temporary facilities, run them off electricity, and then design the transmission to be removed afterwards when you don't need it anymore. So you bring it in, you take it out, or you bring it in along with the pipe. You run the wire along with the prospective pipe.
Let's talk about the heat battery that you referred to, because we've had the CEO of Rondo Heat Battery, which is an
Mhm.
American company, and they're already in commercial production. And they came up to Alberta to talk to oil sands companies. And what they do is they've taken technology, 200-year-old technology from British steelmaking, and where you basically heat up these special bricks and in specific configurations, and then the bricks store the heat, and then you can use it I think it's low to medium grade heat, if I understand correctly. And you can even make electricity if you really want to. But anyway, so you take a surplus electricity like wind and solar, you heat the bricks, and then you use the heat when you need it. And so that there's heat that could go down in the SAGD reservoir to heat the bitumen, or on the mining side, the processing plants also use heat as part of the paraffinic froth treatment. And so that just seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is, Rondo is one approach to batteries to heat storage. There are at least four or five major approaches that have companies behind them, lots of money at commercialization or near commercialization. Several of them are using versions of Rondo where, it's ceramics that are heated one way or the other. I was at a conference just recently where somebody's come up with a molten sulfur battery that's actually very reliable and works with any sort of input heat source. These batteries, the limitation on them, like they didn't have a value before because we had lots of gas, right? Now that we're trying to get off gas, suddenly and there's this surplus electricity to potentially work with. They suddenly have a value. The limitation with them is getting the heat in, which we know how to do with electric resistance heating, but it's getting the heat out. It's working fluids, right? And it's the working fluids being able to bring out the heat at the right rate for whatever job it is you want to do.
My immediate response to that is that I spent 5 years in the oil patch all across North America. One of the lessons I took away from that is that in that industry, there are really, really clever engineers.
Exactly.
There are a lot of smart people who sit down and engineer a solution to this, and I assume that there are some clever engineers in Rondo as well, and these other companies. So my takeaway is this isn't an insurmountable problem; it's a technical issue that needs an engineered solution.
Yes, no, exactly. Now, the interesting thing in moving on to the oil sands is I think you could do that too. The steam you need for SAGD and both SAGD and the standard integrated facilities, but you're going to have to rejig it a bit because they're designed around that instantaneous heat capacity of combusting natural gas. You'd have to redesign the facility a bit to handle the heat rates that could come out of heat batteries. But again, it's an engineering problem. Petrochemical and electrical engineers are very bright people, and Canada's industry is more than capable of figuring it out.
Right, and there's going to be some cost involved. I mean,
Yeah,
let's not
of
start.
course.
But one of the things that's come out of the federal government since the changeover from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, now we have Prime Minister Mark Carney, who is leading in the polls, by the way, which for American viewers, they were down in the high 20s, mid to high 20s. The Liberals were only 3 months ago, and now they are leading and headed for majority government status. So let's assume for a moment that Mark Carney is the Prime Minister after the election, which we're anticipating will be called next week. He has said, we're going to invest in these kinds of technologies. we're going to invest in building things. So it would seem that this is a great opportunity to say we have this industry that creates enormous wealth and revenue for the country, tax money, and the federal government will put money in to do it. So you got clever engineers, you've got the federal government coming with the big red checkbook, as I call it, and that just seems like we've got the problem solved.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, I would look across all the resource sectors in this sense, the various metals, mining, potash, oil and gas. I wouldn't try to do this all by ourselves. We have a very potential willing partner in the Australians. Another Commonwealth country with a very similar research and development establishment as we do. Let's not try to reinvent the wheel here. Let's work on these heat storage technologies. Let's work on the capacity to make renewables and heat storage work together. Let's work on electrolytic, both the electrification of both straight up mining and the smelting of all the various metals and minerals that we need out of those resources.
Yeah, I want to make a point here about critical minerals because a couple of years ago, I interviewed the Bloomberg NEF's head of mining and minerals, global head, and we were talking about the opportunity that Canada has because we have, according to Bloomberg, we have the largest reserves of critical minerals in the world. So we're set up to do batteries. You know, if we're going to create battery metals out of minerals, Canada has the most potential. And I asked him, I said, well, how long do we have? Do we have a decade? So surely 7 years, 8 years, like out to 2030. He said, you got 5 years, maybe less, because
Mm-hmm.
there are many, many hungry middle income countries that want this business. They want these industries, and you have to move quickly because they're aggressive. They move at China time.
Mm-hmm.
Canada doesn't move at China time. Sometimes it doesn't move at all. So the technologies are there. What really we need to do is we need strategies and political will to get this stuff done.
So Canada has a strategic weakness and a strategic strength. Okay, the strategic weakness is that we live inside the North American bubble, where we're slow walking the clean energy transition. Right, we were even when the Americans were friendly to it. Right, we thought we'd slowly ease off oil and gas and slowly ease up the clean energy transition. That's our deep weakness. Our brains are just not set to Chinese and Turkish and Brazilian speed on this, right? That's a fundamental weakness. Fundamental strength, though, is that we are a highly developed, high technology capacity society with extremely strong rule of law. It's one of the strongest rules of law in the world. You make an investment here, you know the deal is going to be kept, which, to be honest, is no longer the case south of the border, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of deals that were in the deals that were sealed, cut and signed are being abrogated. We don't do that. That is when you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars, you need investment certainty.
Yeah, I can see that. And I know we do have a weakness on the regulatory side because the investment community says all the time that Canada needs to refine its regulatory framework, around resource extraction and linear infrastructure, that sort of thing. But we'll leave that for another show. Okay, we've talked about oil and gas. Well, let's talk about minerals and mining because is it not the case that a lot of Canadian mining is already electrified on the extraction side?
Yeah, no, mining by its nature is mostly because you're grinding and digging. The most efficient way to grind, like anytime you're applying a motor with variable torque, the electric motor is going to win over the direct fossil fuel drive motor. That's just basic physics and engineering. So most of the direct end use is already electrified. The problem is they use diesels to get the electricity.
Oh, okay. So now that we can produce electricity on site using renewables, or I suppose you could use hydrogen if you have.
Mm.
But is it the case that you can now electrify all of the extraction process using electricity generated on site, stored on site?
Yeah, extraction is no problem. It's all conveyors, electrifiable trucks, diggers, grinders, what have you. That's all highly electrifiable. Again, the issue is getting the electricity you need. Now, you can do it with local renewables, but I would argue that a better strategy is to open our minds about temporary transition siting, and then designing it to be removed and then the land to be rehabilitated, but the transmission was on.
Oh, I see. So when you open a mine, the utility presumably builds a transmission line out to that operation, but with the intention that it's not permanent, and when the mine is closes, that the transmission line will be recovered and reused.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is a
Okay.
classic example where we could train the what is generally First Nations local communities to build service and remove these lines, and it's generally their land where they're going in, and it's high value, high wage employment that could be handed to.
Well, very interesting. Okay, what about on the processing side for minerals? Because again, getting back to Quasimodo it was his name, and we were talking about smelting and refining. Because if you know anything about the Chinese battery business, you know that China dominates an enormous percentage of the battery supply chain, including smelting and refining the metals that go into that battery, whether that's nickel or
Yeah.
cobalt or whatever it is. And that's a huge opportunity because even with Donald Trump canceling subsidies for battery plants, there are going to be 10 new battery plants coming online in the US, and some of them are quite big. And frankly, the economics are such that we'll probably see an expansion of that industry over time, particularly to provide storage, stationary storage for the grid. There's a big
Hmm.
demand on that side. So let's assume that there's a battery industry emerging in North America around transportation and the power sector, and they're going to need smelted materials, minerals smelted into metals, battery metals that then can go into cells, and cells go into packs, and then packs go into the stationary storage or the electric vehicle. How do we electrify that supply chain so that we can do it all in Canada?
Okay, so the technologies exist. Okay, first of all, just as a high level thing, you want to use as much recycled metal materials as you possibly can. So the very first thing you do is you design all this stuff so it's easy to take apart, end of life, recover all those metals. And you have to anticipate innovation. If something's rare and dangerous and hard to get a hold of, we'll figure out a substitute for it. We're not going to need cobalt forever in batteries. That is just one example. That's very quickly being replaced by lithium iron phosphate, the NMC technology. So the very first thing is design for recovery, design for circularity. But you're always going to need new minerals, and this is where I think some fundamental the R&D exists, right? But it's down at the university PhD level stage, right? It's building up to that commercial level, hundreds, megaton scale, being able to smelt with zero emissions, and it means changing the chemistries. Generally, it's moving, working with electrochemical. Basically, it's a lot of acid leaching and dealing. How do you remove oxygen typically from minerals without carbon monoxide, which is what we've typically done before, right? It's shifting off onto other chemical pathways, and literally we need a center of excellence here in Canada, or we need several of them to do that, to figure that out and pioneer it, because this is going to be a forever industry. It's not something that's going to be around for 20, 30 years, 40 years. You're looking at probably 2 centuries of us using low emissions metals like this before we figure something else. So it's an deep investment in Canada's future.
One of your colleagues that I've interviewed many times is Dr. Bentley Allen from the
Hmm.
Transmission Accelerator in Johns Hopkins University, but good Canadian boy. He's an expert on modern industrial policy. And one of the points he makes is that when new technologies, new processes like this are required, the kind of stuff we're talking about, that the government can take a lead, but it's a very different strategy than the old industrial policies where governments would pick a champion, and hope that they would
No, no,
win. Like Nortel in Canada would be a
yeah,
famous example, and it went bust and didn't work. So now what Bentley is saying, and you see this in China, you see this in the US and in Europe, where you collaborate, you bring in the industry partners, you bring in
yes.
labor, academics, researchers, scientists, everybody, you collaborate. And I should point out that Alberta is doing this very same thing in hydrogen. So there is a model in Canada we already have for this. and then you come together, you design a strategy, and then the various players that are at the table pick part of the plan to implement it. The companies that are involved will do something, and labor will arrange for training, and governments will fund things and research and all of that. And that's your industrial strategy. And I can see where, after what you just said about the designing new processes for smelting and refining, that if we took that approach and we brought all the players together and we had a very clear leadership on this, that this could be something that Canada could lead and be be a global leader in this particular making battery metals from our critical minerals.
I'd argue I would take the same approach to forestry. We have to stop thinking about trees as logs and wood, right? Like literally biomass, and clean carbon very specifically, and clean carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are going to be low. By clean, I mean low GHG, local air pollutant, are going to be extremely valuable by the end of this century and by the 2050s, 2060s, right? We're going to be doing global carbon management because we have to pull it down out of the atmosphere to bring down the concentrations. And if I don't understand why we're not learning how to basically gasify what biomass we have, extract the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen for the highest value chemicals, which started things like aviation fuel, ethylene, polyethylene, what have you. Goes jump from logs to very high value chemicals where you don't need a lot of material, but you need a lot of capital and know-how to get from A to B. So I would do that with minerals. I would do that with forestry products. There's a lot of different things we could do about this. Another example you might want to look up one of these days is the offshore wind accelerator. The British knew there was a lot of high 60-70% capacity factor wind around the British Isles, but it was out in deep water, right? And the companies didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the capital or the risk tolerance to do it. So the companies the UK government went into partnership with 5 or 6 different wind turbine companies. So they all worked together to sort out the parts of the supply chain that didn't work. They used British government money to solve the gaps, right? And then they worked in partnership with the companies. And once that was figured out, everybody walked away with the intellectual property, and then the British government went back into a reverse auction mode, bidding in these new floating turbines that they now knew how to build and service at sea. So it's another way of doing what you're describing.
Yes, and one of the things we've done recently with industrial strategy is we do have an industrial strategy. Jonathan Wilkinson, who was the Minister of Natural Resources and is under Carney, I interviewed him in Vancouver at a press conference, and we talked about industrial strategy. And from his point of view, it has three parts: carbon pricing, regulations, and subsidies. But Canada is a very passive approach to this. It's like, okay, we put these policies into place, and now we wait for the companies to come to us. So if you have a big pot of money like some of these programs at the federal level, we got, $45 billion in them. The bureaucrats are sitting there, twiddling their thumbs, waiting for applications to come in. It's not the government saying, hey, we're gonna co-lead with the private sector on this, and we're going to advance this really quickly and get this done. And it's as much a mindset and how government operates in the economy, the way it does in China, the way it does in Europe, as it is anything else. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, it is passive, but they've been taught to be passive because we've just lived through 30, 40 years of a neoliberal mindset that the market will just deliver, right? The problem is most fundamental jumps in technology have had a government direction component, and they've usually been associated with security in the military, right? Or by sheer economic necessity, right? SAGD, the fundamental oil sands technology, was driven by the Alberta provincial government. And, it's that kind of, they knew there was a huge resource. They couldn't get at it. They figured it out within the government, the core technology, and then they basically dragged the oil and gas sector in with them. I think we kind of need to do the same thing with minerals. We need to do the same with net zero biomass, what have you.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you just referred to what you referred to as Aostra, and it came, Peter Lougheed created it in the 1970s. He was the premier of Alberta. And here at Energy Media, we have been calling for a Peter Lougheed 2.0, a Lougheed 2.0 strategy, where the government provides some of that leadership. And there are plenty of champions on this, folks, because look up Mariana Mazzucato, who's an American British economist. And in her 2016 book, The Entrepreneurial State, she says, don't listen to what the Americans say about the free enterprise. Go look at what they do. And what they do is they spend enormous amounts of money, primarily through the military, like DARPA, which gave us the internet, and they support the basic research. Then they support the taking of that new technology out into a demonstration project. Then once that's done, they support doing a pilot project. And when that's done, they support the commercialization and the scaling up of that technology until it's de-risked, and then the private sector can run with it. And that's been the American model for decades, almost back to the Second World War. And she makes the point that's not what the rhetoric says, that's not the narrative says, but that's how they do things. And that's one of the reasons why America has such a huge innovation economy, and why they are where they're at. In Canada, we believe the rhetoric.
There's a fundamental irony that Tesla is a creation of the California Air Resources Board policy and U.S. federal policy,
Yeah.
and SpaceX is a fundamental creation of the NASA commercial spaceflight program.
Yes, that's exactly right. But if you listen to Elon Musk or Donald Trump, all they talk about is, free market, free enterprise, entrepreneurs, billionaires, yada yada yada, and just conveniently ignore, because it is inconvenient for them, ignore all of that public money that went into those technologies. Anyway, okay, so we've talked about timber, minerals, oil and gas, and I'm an old Saskatchewan boy. I've probably spent half of my life in Saskatchewan, and I know how important farming is. Most of it's grain farming. What do we do with agricultural produce? Because we've been talking about making food out of the stuff we
Right.
grow, and we're not very good at that.
With agriculture is actually one of the fundamental areas where we can learn how to go net negative, right,
Oh,
and still make food, right?
okay.
Because the way we've run agriculture, we've deforested, then run down a soil base, and once you did that, we put a lot of fertilizer in with a lot of emissions, what have you, gradually producing worse and worse food as we went, right? You can turn all that around, like the fundamental agricultural technology to naturally fertilize an area with practices, with no-till, with legume plants, what have you, and then to return fertility to soil and to store carbon underground as you go, all exists. But it's a matter of education and incentives, right? Like, Canadian farmers are incredibly capable, right? Like, they were the original engineers that kind of drove our initial industrial revolution, because they had to figure out how to maintain everything in a place with no machine shop and no spare, or they had to make a machine shop and they had no spare parts. So they had to make everything, right? They can figure out, with the right incentives, to return fertility, like let a lot of land, let the marginal land go back to forest, right? Let it be a sink. But then with the lands you're still working with, turn them into carbon sinks, let them fertilize naturally, and go back into a mode of making food for us, but also acting as a carbon sink, and pay them to do it. Make it a revenue stream.
I actually have some information on that, because my master's thesis dealt with Professor Evan Hardy from the University of Saskatchewan. And during the 20s, when tractors and then combines were being introduced to Saskatchewan farms, the University of Saskatchewan held tractor farms. And there was Professor Hardy and A.R. Grieg, who designed many of the buildings at the university, my alma mater. They would go out onto farms, and there would be dozens and dozens of farmers who would come, and they would show them how tractors worked, and show them how the implements worked, and they discuss the economics and all of that kind of thing. And so the point is, and there's still some of that going on. That's like the demonstration farms and so on that the federal and provincial governments run are still around. But it's not really a big focus. There's not a sense of, hey, we need to change things in a hurry. Let's really put some resources into this and be innovative. But we know how to do it. We've done it 100 years ago, and it's not like this stuff is rocket science. We can figure it out again in a hurry.
Well, going back to industrial policy, Canada industrialized in three major phases, right? Or early on before we got to the 1950s. The first was the agricultural colleges, which was training the farmers on the land how to get to higher yields, how to maintain their farms, what have you. And there was a phase of industrialization that happened very dispersed across Canada. Then comes World War One, where we start learning how to build machinery and guns and early airplanes and engines, what have you. Then comes World War II, where we went right to the technological frontier in terms of aviation and electronics and everything else. Like that is the history of and that's how the vehicle production got going in Ontario. That is our real industrial history. It's not something else invented out of the free market history of Canada.
Well, that is very interesting, and I would agree with you wholeheartedly. And a lot of that is also true of the Americans. I mean, the
Yeah, no,
military,
that they followed the same model.
yeah, except they just had a lot more wars than we did.
Yeah,
But
I know a lot of, and they pushed their space flight program, and they pushed IT and what have you, and they've been reaping the rewards of it, and but not recognizing how they got there publicly.
yeah, that's right. We'll do it, but we won't talk about it, not publicly. All right. So, one of the industries that I wanted to talk about, because this is kind of a classic example, is the aluminum industry in Quebec, which is, Donald Trump just put a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. 56% of the aluminum they use, 58%, sorry, in the United States comes from Canada.
Hmm.
And the only reason there's an aluminum industry in Quebec is because they have really cheap, reliable, clean electricity. And somebody once said that aluminum is just embodied electricity, is really all that's the product. And is that kind of a model here for how Canada can electrify other industries and expand them?
It is partly, but aluminum processing is very specific. Every industry has very specific processes and chemical transformations you're trying to do. So I don't know if you can directly extrapolate aluminum. And again, aluminum production in Canada largely got going to feed the American war effort because they needed a lot of aluminum for aircraft. Right. So, and a lot of the capital that got it built in and especially in the West, a lot of the dams, it's American flood control and need for aluminum for aluminum for Boeing in Seattle, to be honest. Again, things like this, we need to think, where are the emissions still in the aluminum sector? It's partly electricity, which is zero in Quebec, very heavy in China, but it's in the cathode, it's in the electrodes that drop into the pot, and then electricity passes through, an electron gets passed to the aluminum oxide ion. The oxygen is now free to float away, and it tends to attach itself to the carbon on the electrode, and that's, you get 2 tons of CO2 with every ton of aluminum. If you have an inert electrode that does not react, right, you'll have free oxygen coming away, and then the liquid aluminum. Now that inert electrode has been sitting on the shelf for about 20 to 30 years. It needed a lot of development, and it got sped up. And there was a joint company with the Quebec provincial government, I believe it was Alcan and Apple, of all people, saying they would provide money in the initial demand because they wanted to make their phones and their computers out of zero GHG aluminum. And this was about 5-7 years ago. And that's how that, and I'm not quite sure where Elysis is right now, how close they are to commercialization. It was supposed to be roughly about now, 5 years ago, when it would be ready to go. But those are the kind of partnerships and jumps that we need to make.
Well, let's close out the interview with this bit of question, Chris, because it seems like clean, low cost, reliable electricity is vital to, if we're going to electrify extraction, electrify value-added processes, and if you can produce the kind of electricity like Quebec does or BC Hydro did for aluminum, the research and development will take place to use that to do the electrification. Because none of this stuff, not 100% of it is off the shelf. We still need to do engineering
Right,
and
right.
research. Fair enough. But really, to make all of this work, you've got to have the kind of power sector that we have had in the past in Canada, But now we have to double, triple, or, you and I have talked about this in previous interviews, that as we electrify things, the Canadian the electricity sector is going to have to generate 2 or 3 times as much electricity. That's a
Yeah.
huge expansion,
Yes, it
and
is.
it has to continue to be low cost, clean, and reliable. And
Yes.
so that's a part of this that has to go hand in hand as the electrification takes place.
Yeah, and to be honest, Canada's in a bit of a different. Most places in more around the middle of the world can count on reliable power seasonally, right? They can go to solar and wind plus batteries, right? And then some long duration storage or assets to fire up if there happens to be cloudy days or a dunk afloat. Canada's in a different position because we go through these deep troughs through the winter. So I would argue the first thing is pull off the brakes on all the renewables. Just get as much renewables as you can built, right? Because that, and then build more transmission, especially to regions with hydro, because the more renewables is on the grid, you can keep the dams loaded with what water is available, right? Because as we go into more climate change, we're going to have more variable snowpack, and keeping those dams as full as possible is the insurance policy for everybody connected to those dams. And one of the ways you keep them full is to maximize wind and solar production. But that's not going to be enough. We probably need to reinvigorate our nuclear program. And and each province probably needs at least one gigawatt, 2 gigawatts, possibly more. And it's just useful technology, and it's useful R&D that carries us forward. And we're one of the safest and best. We have been in the past one of the safest and best producers of nuclear power in the world. But the first thing is max the wind and solar, build out the transmission, especially to the hydro dams. Think about them as storage, not as energy storage. They're balancing units. They're nodes in the network that act as massive batteries. And then over the decades, build out nuclear to supplement this whole thing.
So what we've talked about here is the adding value to natural resources. That's step number one. Electrifying both the extraction and the processing of those natural resources. And three, building out the infrastructure, of which the power sector would be a large part, so that process can take place. None of that is rocket science. None of that
No,
is beyond our
no,
capability. This
nope.
this is all stuff that we've talked about for years, and the only reason it's back on the agenda in the way it is because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is putting economic pressure on us. We now want to go east and west. We want to trade east and west in our economy. We want to export more off our coasts into other countries, like regions like Europe or Asia. That's the only reason we're having this conversation. But that's a great reason. If that's what it took, is that political disruption from Donald Trump in the United States, then bring it on, because we have a strategy that we can make work, and it's better for the Canadian economy. We can be as prosperous, more prosperous if we do this than if we just stuck with the same old.
No, I absolutely agree.
Okay. That is a wonderful note on which to end our interview. Thank you very much, Chris. Always enjoy
My
talking.
pleasure.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.